Hello. So this is the second video of Book 1 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 2. We're still trying to talk about the sort of psychological and anthropological foundations of the study of metaphysics. And we're still trying to prove to you why it is honorable, why it's sort of the completion of being a human, and why you should study it. Sort of a hard sell. So he's really taking everything he can, all the rhetorical guns, to sort of convince you that this is worthwhile. In the next book, the second book, Little Alpha of the Metaphysics, we'll see some reasons to sort of like counterbalance what's happening in this beginning of book 1. But for now, I'm going to convince you that metaphysics is worth studying, because I'm going to show you that not only do human beings desire to know by our biological nature, but wondering, the ability, the experience of looking at something that we don't understand, and like, wow, that's amazing. Like, what's going on there? Like, what is that? What could it be? What could explain what's happening right now? That experience of wonder is fundamentally human, and it leads us to the highest forms of knowledge of which the human being is capable of, which we could spend our entire life contemplating the things that we come to know, the most difficult things that we already know, and we experience them again and again by contemplating them, wondering again, only this time with knowledge. So that's what he's going to do. If you take a look at the very first paragraph of chapter 2, he starts by saying, since we're seeking this knowledge, this should be examined about what sort of causes and what sort of sources wisdom is the knowledge. In the previous chapter, he said, this is what metaphysics is about. It's about first causes and sources of everything that we see, experience, think, know, wonder about. But now he's going to try and make it more specific. So for your notes, I think you could put it into like roughly 5 or 6 categories. He starts by examining the things that we associate with people we believe to be wise. You have to ask yourself, who do I consider to be wise, and what kinds of things do they know? Then he talks more specifically about what metaphysics would be, based on that, what we believe the wise man to have. Then he talks about the kind of knowledge that would rule, the kind of knowledge that ought to be in charge. So wisdom, rule, then his beautiful description of human wondering, which we'll talk about, an interesting discussion of human freedom and why metaphysics would be part of human freedom, an argument about the divine. Maybe metaphysics is the most divine way of knowing that human beings are capable of. And then finally, this argument that tails off into a sense of a transition from wondering at things we're ignorant of to contemplating things we've finally come to know. So in all of this, it's important to remember, we discussed this long ago in the semester, but the word we have for what metaphysics is, the study of first causes and origins, what it is to be being, all of this comes from, like the English word metaphysics just means literally in Greek, the stuff that comes after physics. So we spent a decent amount of time earlier in the semester talking about the natural world, starting with Thales, discussing some of Aristotle's physics, talking about how Thomas Aquinas connects our sensations in the natural world to some kind of first cause or source of the entire cosmos. But we're finally in a position to say, if there is something after the physics, even because physics is just the description of causality, what would the metaphysics be? What would come after a belief in cause in the natural world? So all of these descriptions, things that the wise men know, things that people who rule know, things we wonder at, human freedom, divine knowledge, and finally, a hope for some kind of contemplative knowledge. All these things are trying to begin. It's the very beginning of the book. You got to give them time to sort of speak to what could come after simply a physical knowledge of physical causality. So now we're on the second sentence of chapter 2. So now if one takes the accepted opinions we have about the wise men, perhaps from this it will become more clear. All right. Again, we're dealing with doxa, just people's opinions, common psychological things that happen, just sort of how people feel without thinking out too hard about the wise men. wisdom tends to be our word in English, as it is for Greek. It's just whoever knows the best, someone you respect, not simply because they seem to have lots of technical details, but also like some kind of holistic understanding of the world. We can see if what he says really maps onto that. Okay, so we assume first that the wise man knows all things. Okay, that's great. In the way that it's possible. Okay, fair enough. Though he does not have knowledge of them as particulars. Okay. So a knowledge of everything without a knowledge of everything. The most important things, you could say. Next, we assume that the one who's able to know things are difficult, one who's able to know things that are difficult and not easy for a human being to know is wise. Perception's common to everyone, for which it's easy and not wise. So something hard, okay, fair. Everything, without the particulars, hard. Also, we assume that this person has precision, and is more able to teach the causes. That person would be wiser. And then also, like more above all these things, we assume that this person knows things that are for their own sake and chosen for the sake of knowing, not for the sake of results. Just as when we saw that he claimed that the priests in Egypt know geometrical knowledge that isn't actually about construction, but it's simply pure geometrical knowledge for its own sake. And how he was really building, there's a rhetorical build. It says, okay, all of these things, hard, everything, without the particulars, it's precision. You can teach the causes, so cause is present. But also you don't do it for the sake of results. And then it gets really, this is the peak of this paragraph. And we assume that the more ruling one is wisdom, more so than the subordinate one. For the wise man ought not to be commanded, but to give orders, and ought not to obey someone else. But the less wise ought to obey him. So this is a great description of Plato's Republic. It's sort of utopian in its vision in the way that Aristotle talks about it in this passage. Because do we assume that the person in charge is wise? I mean, we hope so, right? It's fascinating that he starts getting angry about the idea that, of course, the wise person would rule, and that whatever this kind of best knowledge, this metaphysical knowledge we would have, it would be the kind that's in charge, even though it's not chosen for the sake of results. It's not about particulars. Very strange. But he seems to want to give it the kind of respect that ruling knowledge would have, that we would have respect for a ruler. All right, second paragraph. Now it goes a little deeper. We have then such and so many accepted opinions about wisdom and those who are wise. This is what people tend to think. It's not necessarily what's true. Now he gets into a better analysis. Now of these, the knowing of all things must belong to the one who has most of all the universal knowledge, since he knows in a certain way all the things that come under it. And these are just about the most difficult things for human beings to know, those that are most universal, since they're farthest away from the senses. So that gives you why it would be possible to know all things without knowing everything. We're looking for universals. We're looking for patterns and formulas and things that happen again and again in the world that are in some sense broad, that totalitize your understanding of it, that are sort of universal in this particular way. They're far away from whatever the things that we start with in the senses, even though they are present in them. And so the most precise of the kinds of knowledge, all of the different ways of knowing in the world, are the ones that are directed at first things, since those that reason from fewer things are more precise than those that reason from extra ones, as arithmetic is more precise than geometry. So a nice Hume connection here. Last week, Hume was saying that geometry simply was not an example of any kind of real universal knowing, because the shapes that we see in the world, you abstract out the circle, the square, the triangle, etc. That's just like fuzzy memory putting together like impressions in just kind of a fake way, not real. So he's saying like, okay, there is something better about arithmetic than geometry. He agrees with Hume about that, but it's not about exactly about what reality the knowledge has. It's about its precision. And the example of the precision is about that it comes from fewer premises, you could say, than geometry does. And we've talked a lot about this in class, so you guys should, that should make sense to you. we reason from the unit, the one, unto the many of arithmetic. It's a simpler way of, it requires fewer like foundational premises than geometry, which requires also knowledge about space in addition to arithmetic. Okay, so that's his first example of where you could find first things, and that's where we're headed in all of this. That somewhere among all these causes that even artisans know, there might be something that is first. Concrete example: arithmetic seems to be more constructed around first things, just if only because there's slightly fewer of them. Turning off the group chat. All right, so now we've talked about two different ways that metaphysics, we're moving from accepted opinions about metaphysics to a slightly more precise understanding of what it would be about. Most universal, directed at first things. Also, but it's going to be about what you could teach, which you could really communicate to another person. What we saw in the Parmenides, which was Parmenides' sort of gold standard for what real knowledge would look like, not just knowing the forms of everything, but being able to communicate it to another. So he says, okay, surely the person who can do that is the one who has more insight into causes. For those people who teach, who give an account of the causes of each thing. All so far so good, but then things get really get deeper. And knowing and understanding, for their own sakes, belong most to the knowledge of what is most knowable. For the one who chooses what is known through itself would most of all be choosing that which is knowledge most of all. And of this sort is the knowledge of what is most knowable. So we saw this in Plato. This should be a fairly familiar idea. Some things are intrinsically more knowable than others. In the Republic, Socrates talks about the world of the senses as being one of becoming, which you can't trust because images of things that you experience and even just the physical world is simply more fuzzy than mathematical objects and the forms themselves. That's not the direction that Aristotle's going to go completely in this particular work, but he is still basing this idea, this basic metaphysical idea that some things would be more intrinsically capable of being known than others. So whatever metaphysics is, it's going to know those things. And here at 982b3, he says, but what are most noble are the first things and the causes. For through these and from these, the other things are known, but not the other way around. So this is different from Aquinas. Aquinas thinks that the first principle of the universe is reasonably called God, is not the same as a Christian God, but potentially related to him. But there is something about this first principle that is not knowable by human knowledge. So already in Aristotle, we see a big difference. The first principle is the most knowable, that is to say, by us. He will raise some difficulties with our ability to know it, but right now, whatever metaphysics is, it's going to give us that complete, total, fundamental understanding of what the world is, and it won't be like a mishmash of weird details in becoming. My last video, we're talking about wool and about metal. It won't be like that. It's going to be universal and capable of being thoroughly and completely understood because of what it is. And the most ruling of the kinds of knowledge, or the one more ruling than what is subordinate to it, is the one that knows for what purpose each thing must be done. And this is the good of each thing, and in general, the best thing in the whole of nature. So from all the things that have been said, the name sought falls to the same kind of knowledge, for it must be a contemplation of the first sources and causes, since also the good, or that for the sake of which, is one of the causes. This is one of his first stabs at defining what metaphysics would be. And this should probably sound fairly familiar to you from the Iris Murdoch and the Plato that we read. It's a fascinating overlap. We were looking for the best kind of knowledge. Ruling was one of our metaphors. And it looks like that knowledge of the good of each thing would be the thing that you knew, the person who knew that would know for what purpose each thing must be done. And the best thing in the whole of nature. He says the good is obviously one of the causes. So since it's also the good, or that for the sake of which is one of the causes. So in a way, he will tease this out later, but there is overlap between this and the Republic. It's almost one of his best images at this point of what metaphysics on Earth would be about, would be that for the sake of which the final cause is related to something that is good. Does this knowledge sound not practical anymore, like he was claiming with the Egyptians and their useless knowledge? I don't know. This is difficult. To me, it seems like he really is struggling in his argument and slightly, probably, definitely on purpose, going back and forth between utterly useless knowledge, knowledge that doesn't have particulars at all, and knowledge that would have some kind of knowledge of what should be done about each thing and what would be good for everything. Maybe generally, maybe not about the particulars, but still kind of ruling. What you need to know is that it's the best. That's what all these arguments are about. So now he's given this description, and now he'll go on to talk about his lovely description of what wonder is. Switching back away from the good to saying that it's not productive knowledge. So the people who first engaged in philosophy, by way of wondering, they now and again began to work at philosophy, wondering first about the strange things near at hand, then going forward little by little in this way, and coming to impasses about greater things, such as the attributes of the moon and things pertaining to the sun, and the stars, and the coming into being of the whole. For someone who wonders, and is in an impasse, considers himself to be ignorant, for which reason the lover of myth is in a certain way philosophic, since a myth is composed of wonders. So if it was by fleeing ignorance that they philosophized, it is clear that by means of knowing, they were in pursuit of knowing, and not for the sake of any kind of use. So this is the idea, and this is something that you can talk about in office hours, as well as on the discussion boards. It really would help you, I think, if you came up with an instance that made sense to you of something within your experience of what you had wondered at. I like the idea that when we read Greek mythology, we are, in a way, being philosophers, because we know that the story explains something that we don't understand, what we find mysterious. We're not reading the mythology so that we can act immediately or for some kind of immediate, pressing, useful purpose. We're reading it because we desperately want to know something about this strange phenomenon that we're discussing. We have no idea, and the myth helps us wonder at it and sort of sustain our wonder past like a brief little flicker into something that could springboard into greater pursuit of knowledge. What's an easy myth to talk about? Oedipus would be easy at this point, but think about Phaedon, the guy who claimed that his father was a sun god and that he was boasting to his friends, and his father was the sun god, but he told his friends that his dad let him drive the sun car up to the sky, and of course his father didn't think that was a good idea, but kind of let him do it anyway. So he does it, and of course it goes wrong because he's human, he's not a god. So he drives up to the sun, and the heat starts hurting him, and the horses are hard to control, and the sun kind of like shakes that day and falls out of the sky, and of course he dies. So what is that a story about? It's about human beings' attempt to know things that could possibly be beyond their power to do, to see the sun, to experience what it really like to be the son of the sun god. And yet we know almost before the story started, that it was not going to work out well. The story sustains your wonder of that basic difference between humans and immortal, in a way that allows you to think, well, what would that be? Why are we different? Why do I know already that Phaeton is going to fall flaming to his death? And then at the end of the paragraph, still stressing the point that we do this for no useful thing, it's clear that then we seek it for no other use at all. But just as that human being is free, we say, who has his own being for his own sake, and not for the sake of someone else, so also do we seek it as being the only one of the kinds of knowledge that is free, since it alone is for its own sake. This is a nice, and to me, a stronger argument than the possibly more rhetorical arguments or the more utopian arguments about rule being the one who has the most wisdom, or the master craftsman having a sort of like a natural rule over the manual laborer. Why? Because in my utopia, the manual laborer would never be the person with knowledge, because as soon as he would have knowledge, he would catapult to the upper class of the master craftsman. Those are based on subordination. This one is based on a human being being free, who has his being for his own sake and not for the sake of something else. So in this image, which relies on metaphysical reasoning to move us past political subordination to someone who is for his own sake, who has his final cause in himself, and his being is to be for his own sake. That's part of what it means to be human, is to be free and not subordinated to someone else. Apparently metaphysics is the kind of knowledge that most of all allows us to see what that would mean and express our freedom as human beings and not subordinate. So the claim is, by the end of this chapter, we in a certain way settle into the opposite of what we began our striving with. We began with ignorance, we began with particulars. We have to move through the wholeness of what particulars present to us about the natural world. I can't leave the natural world behind, but I have to use articulate speech in order to explain the causes, in order to grasp my own being as a human, which is to be free and to know. So I hope that is a good sell for the beginning of this book, and I'll talk to you guys about it tomorrow.